Hello and welcome to the first video of the Real Stories series, where I will be looking at the lives of real people that have been represented in games, movies, and TV series, and even books. For this video, I will be looking at the real life of Billy Kimber, who most of you will know as a notorious criminal from the hit BBC TV series Peaky Blinders.
That's your level. I am Billy Kimber.
Who, unlike the fictional Tommy Shelby, was actually a real person. In the series of Peaky Blinders, Billy is the villain of the first season. He's portrayed as this kind of Weasley sly dog who uses his men to do all his dirty work. He isn't exactly what I would consider the most intimidating of characters, when in actual fact, real-life Billy Kimber was far more similar to our own Tommy Shelby in terms of mannerisms and personality.
Put them on your face, or it'll be your eyes that are broken. Please don't imagine that I won't use this minute to do it, or that I am afraid of your prayers or your crosses.
So because of the time period and the limited resources, this will be a broader overview than what I would have liked to achieve with this study. But to understand the life of Billy Kimber, we're first going to look at the time and the setting that he lived in. So let's just get into it. From the late 1800s onwards, Britain was changing rapidly with what was known as the Industrial Revolution. During this time, there was a huge boost in agricultural trade. This large increase in food production allowed for a much larger population to be sustained, paving the way to industrialisation. This changed the way the entire country functioned. New machines and factories increased the demand for coal as a fuel source. Canals were developed as an easy transportation method for large amounts of goods, which were then later overtaken by the frequent use of trains as the upkeep cost for canals was way too high. Smoking factories soon dominated the skyline. The smog was thick and lingered in almost all the streets, which would eventually lead to sickness among the populace. This increase in production could only be sustained by the high amount of workers. This meant that the demand for workers was much higher in the cities than in the fields, so people flocked to their nearest city in hopes of work. Because of this, you can kind of guess that overcrowding soon became a problem. By the 1900s, 85% of Britain's population resided in a large town or a city. Birmingham, originally being one of the smallest cities in the UK, soon became the second largest, with Irish immigration rates rising by 4%. At this time, Britain was home to 500,000 people, most of which had extremely poor living conditions. While most UK towns and cities specialised in a specific production, Manchester had cotton, Sheffield had steel, Glasgow had ships. With Birmingham, it was much harder to pin down on any one production, but it was known for being the country's #1 manufacturer. It was originally called Brummagem, but when it became a more respected city, it changed its name to Birmingham, City of 1,000 Trades. It became an ideal site for gunsmiths and soon became the major arms manufacturer of the world. Divisions of social classes became more prevalent, with the upper classes moving in to live in Outer Aston and Edgbaston. The lower classes lived in the back-to-back houses that covered Birmingham city centre. These houses would often home around 9 to 12 people, most of which would be family. It was a dirty, unpleasant way to live, but work was aplenty. This urban society was a breeding ground for violent young gangs. They emerged from the slums of the city and had free rein in a country that had very little law enforcement and hardly any protection for the lower class citizens. If you were lucky enough to survive childhood, you often found that the best way to cope under poor conditions was to band together with family and other workers of your area. It is said that this is how the well-known street gang known as the Peaky Blinders came about. This particular set of ruffians was not an organised gang as most are led to believe, but rather a small group of young petty thieves and vandals. In fact, other than the popular mugshots, there are no reports of the Peakies after 1918. It is presumed that most grew up and became standard workers, all except a few, one of which is our very own Billy Kimber. Billy Kimber was born William Kimber on the 7th of February. His actual birth year has been debated, but it is believed to have been 1883. He was born and raised in the tough neighbourhood of Summer Lane, Aston in Birmingham. His father, also William Kimber, worked as the brass trade to provide for his family. His mother, Catherine, was of Irish descent and her own family immigrated from Ireland to Birmingham many years prior. I'm uncertain as to how many siblings Billy had, but I do know that he had at least 2 brothers, Harry and Joseph, who were both just as reckless and troublesome as him. Billy's family resided rather close to the gun quarter, where the majority of the Britain's munitions were made. I can imagine that this was potentially how these boys managed to get weapons during this time. The location you lived tended to be where your allegiance was formed. Families would band together with the locals to form some sort of protection. If you weren't liked by another family, it was very, very risky to visit any of their local pubs for fear of harm. So it comes as no surprise that Billy grew up to be a rather rowdy and violent young man. It was speculated that he and his brothers fell in with the Peaky Blinders, and that is where their petty crimes began. By his teenage years, Billy had grown to be rather well built and could hold himself in a way that was considered threatening. He was known to have preferred to use his fists in a fight rather than the use of weapons. During this time, Billy had been showing signs of leadership, becoming more domineering and powerful at the prospect of these boys following his orders. It was here that Billy began to separate himself from the average street thugs, and the Birmingham boys soon began to form. At the age of 18, Billy's violent tendencies took a turn for the worse, and he was arrested for grievous assault in 1901. Upon arrest, he acted violently when he was taken to police station. He was then tried and served his time at Winston Green Prison. For reference, it is now called the HM Prison in Birmingham. Before he was arrested, Billy's girlfriend Anna had a little girl with him named Maud. It is said that Billy and Anna got married a year later, but it is not confirmed. It was at Winston Green Prison that Billy met George Brummie Sage, a dangerous man in his own right who had close connections to the Birmingham underground. Sage seemed to have taken a liking to Billy and had taken sort of a mentor role, educating Billy on racecourse extortion. The UK had a regulation known as the Gambling Act of 1845. This Act of Parliament was to outlaw any gambling in the UK other than at a racecourse. So of course this meant that racecourse gambling was a business of thriving wealth, with attendance at their peak and an annual turnover approaching 500 million. These gangs were using this for their own business. As anybody could set up as a bookmaker, there was no required document. It was a largely unregulated business that was easy to be involved in. This budding friendship would extend into later life, where Sage would become Billy's lieutenant. When Billy was released, he was then sentenced to a further 2 months hard labour for assaulting 2 police officers while they were reporting to a disturbance in the area. He then set to work on gaining control of the Birmingham boys alongside his 2 brothers, one of which was still in prison. Before Billy could put any plans in motion, his life began to have a few hiccups. He had another child, and then in 1907 Billy lost his 3rd child, Jessica. This loss would have put a strain on any relationship, and with Billy's occupational lifestyle, he up and left both Anna and his children. He had taken the advice of Sage on board, and by 1913 Billy Kimber and the Birmingham boys had took control of the racecourses across the Midlands. Billy had been making connections with other gang leaders across the UK, such as Leeds and the McDonald's brothers, to divide the territory peacefully and without conflict. It is said that Billy was a bit of a smooth talker. He was handsome and domineering. While it seemed like he had a bit of a short fuse, he also had the ability to get what he wanted without the use of violence. In January, there was a report of Billy Kimber, his brother Joseph Kimber, and George White arriving by train to the Derby tracks. The police followed them in pursuit, but they escaped when they noticed they were being followed. Joseph Kimber was reported to have quite a few arrests through the upcoming years, all connected to criminal activity with his brother. With bookies pulling in a profit each race, Billy Kimber, with the advice given to him by Sage, used his men to profit from them. When a bookie took bets, the Birmingham boys would take a cut of their profits as payment for services such as protection. Essentially, they were glorified bodyguards. If you were a bookie who decided you didn't need protection, the gangs would often form a threatening circle around the bookie, ensuring that they couldn't make any money from clients. Gangs like the Birmingham boys ended up being surprisingly popular among the general public. People would feel more comfortable attending races with their presence, as there would be little to no thieves willing to go up against them. Police tended to turn a blind eye to it, as well as it made their job slightly easier. It was here that Billy's drive for control and power pushed their expansion of the racecourses to London, one of the hotspots. While Billy and the Birmingham boys had total control of the Midlands, London was another story. He had already formed alliances down in London with other criminals such as Charles Wag MacDonald, and continued to help and travel between London and Birmingham frequently. This tactic went on for quite a few years. Billy Kimber made a name for himself and the Birmingham boys. At this time, he was known as the most powerful gangster in England. So we have just reached World War I, And that's where I'm going to leave this part, and hopefully you'll return for part 2. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.